Thank you very much, Roland. We'll start with questions here in Brussels, German television.
My name is Kai Niklasch, German television ZDF. One for Anna and one for Roland. The mandate, how long will it last, the current one we have, and will there be the need for an extension and a meeting to extend the mandate? Because I think after 3 months it's over normally. And one for Colonel Lavoie. There were heads of the army and parts of the Gaddafi family that left Libya already. They took refuge in the neighboring countries. Do you have any idea now, after maybe getting some intelligence advices, where Gaddafi is? Is he still in the country or has he already left the country? Because Mr. Ocampo just said the other day that he's calling for Interpol to pursue Gaddafi now, and for me that's a clear sign that he may have left the country already.
Kai, on the mandate, as you know, the situation remains very fluid. It changes by the hour, so our military authorities and the North Atlantic Council continue to assess the situation on the ground. Right now it's premature to talk about extending the mandate or indeed terminating the mission. What I can say is what the Secretary General has made very clear, that we will continue the mission for as long as necessary, but it is also our clear intention to terminate the mission as soon as possible. If there is to be any extension, that decision has not been taken. That would be a technical decision because there is a clear determination to terminate this operation, to get the job done for as long as it takes, but no longer than it takes. Roland.
For your question. First, you're right in a sense that several key leaders of the regime has fled the country, very senior commanders and decision makers. So very clearly there was an exodus to some extent. Having said that, thinking about Gaddafi specifically, to be frank, we don't know if he has left the country. He has not made public appearances in the country now for a while, and this certainly raised questions about his whereabouts. But we don't have any sure information about where he is at this time. One thing I would like to stress, however, and you know that, but we are not in the business of targeting and chasing Gaddafi. So of course our focus is on protecting the civilian population, but I don't have, and we don't have globally some information specifically about his whereabouts.
Reuters.
Yes, David Brunstrom from Reuters. Colonel, I understand that you don't have specific information, but what would be your best guess as to Gaddafi's whereabouts? And I noticed that the commander of the operation was quoted in the Canadian press last week as saying that Gaddafi, NATO was aware that Gaddafi was in Tripoli and moving around in tunnels to and from his compound of the Rixos Hotel. At what point did your intelligence let you down and you lose contact with him?
Thanks, David. We receive intelligence confirming indeed that at various times in the conflict, Gaddafi was clearly within the country, but for a while he has not given any sign of life, and frankly, like I don't have the information, and if I would have it, I may not be in a position to disclose it. So I'm sorry, but I have to disappoint you. I don't have any more to say on that.
AP.
Well, as you know, there's a major Taliban attack going on in the heart of Kabul today, and I'm just reading the Stratfor report here saying that it's unique in the sense that the militants have demonstrated the capability to, hit at the heart of the Western military and intelligence presence in Afghanistan. In view of a series of high-profile Taliban attacks recently, do you think, it seems that the Libya operation has really distracted NATO from Afghanistan. Would that be correct?
No, that would not be correct. NATO is conducting several major operations. The operation to protect the people of Libya and to enforce the United Nations mandate for the no-fly zone and the arms embargo is one such operation, and we've shown that we can conduct that operation successfully and effectively together with our partners. At the same time, Afghanistan remains the key operation for NATO, and we continue to remain committed to that operation. As you know, we're following developments very closely. We have full confidence in the Afghan security forces that they can deal with such attacks as they have in the past. We've seen the enemies of Afghanistan trying to test transition in the past. They have not succeeded, and they will not succeed. They will not derail transition, and they will not stop transition. That process is already underway in 7 provinces and districts that represent a quarter of the population of Afghanistan. We expect the next stage of transition to get underway soon and to be just as significant. Clearly, the Taliban may be trying to gain media attention with such attacks, but the reality on the ground is that the number of enemy-initiated attacks in Kabul and across Afghanistan is actually down on last year. So the trend of violence in Afghanistan is down, not up. And what is also very clear is that vast parts of the population have rejected the Taliban and continue to reject the Taliban. In the last minutes, ISAF in Kabul has issued a news release, and I will read it to you. A small group of insurgents attacked the vicinity of the US Embassy and International Security Assistance Force Afghanistan headquarters today, firing from outside the compound using small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. The attack started around 1:30 p.m. local. Afghan National Security Forces and coalition forces immediately responded to the attack and are still on the scene. Coalition forces are providing air support. There are no reports of ISAF casualties at this time. So, for any other operational details, I will refer you to our colleagues in Kabul. We can go now to Naples for the next questions, and then we'll return to Brussels. Roland.
Yes, Marinella Correggia, freelance journalist. I have a question for Mrs. Longhescu and a question for Mr. Lavoie. The first question is coming back to the beginning, as you quote the beginning of the operations and the reason of this war. Is NATO aware of the fact that this war is based on a major lie. The 10,000 people who were supposed to be killed by Gaddafi forces at the beginning of the protest, but in fact even the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in the warrant, in its warrant, speaks about 200 people, and Amnesty International speaks about 200 victims on both sides. So Gaddafi side and the other side. So is NATO aware that this war to protect civilians started from a huge, huge media lie? This is the first question. The second question is for Mr. Lavoie. NATO is not supposed to take sides. But it seems that really you take sides. It's in the fact, and it is in your words. For instance, when Misrata was under siege and the civilians were trapped into fightings, and the Libyan army was around Misrata, NATO bombed heavily Libyan forces. This time, there are many towns, Seba. I have some friends from African countries who are trapped there, and not because of the Libyan army. Seba, Ben Walid, and Sirte, they are under siege, but the siege is made by Abdel Jalil forces. So why NATO is not trying to protect those civilians who cannot go out? It's the same situation than Misrata. And also why NATO did nothing to protect the black migrants and the black Libyans who were killed by the so-called rebel forces when they entered Tripoli and other cities. They are civilians too, I guess.
Thank you for those questions. A quick answer from me. NATO is not involved in a war in Libya. NATO is enforcing a United Nations mandate to protect civilians, to enforce the no-fly zone and the arms embargo, under two very clear and strong United Nations Security Council resolutions, 1970 and 1973. And I think those resolutions speak for themselves. Roland.
Similarly, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify something here. I know there's several calls at all ends of the ideological spectrum calling for NATO to take sides in this conflict. I will tell you and reaffirm clearly, if there's one side, and the only side we will take is the one of the Libyan people, our mandate is not to provide closer support for the anti-Gaddafi forces or to wage a war against pro-Gaddafi forces. Our mandate is to protect the civilian population, and this is what we are doing. And one aspect that maybe get a bit less attention in this mission is that beside the strike missions that for obvious reason attract a lot of attention, we are constantly patrolling the skies and providing a presence that very often deters attacks from happening. We are patrolling also the waters to prevent weapons from coming in. We have 24/7 operations, both at sea and in the air, to monitor and to track whatever threat could be identified against the civilian population. So this is what we are after. As I mentioned earlier, we're not after Gaddafi. We are aiming at protecting the civilian population, and this is not a NATO venture. This is a venture of the international community that, through the United Nations, decided to vote 2 resolutions calling upon nations of the planet to unite, nations that were like-minded to help the civilian population. and NATO responded, and not only NATO, but also partner countries to make a difference, and this is what we're doing.
I take it we'll go back to Brussels, where we still have quite a few questions. We had the Belgian news agency here.
Oui, Gérard Gaudin de Belga. Je sais que l'exercice est un petit peu difficile. Vous n'avez pas de troupes au sol, etc. Mais est-ce qu'on a une idée du pourcentage à peu près du territoire qui est soit aux mains encore des pro-Kadhafi, soit aux mains du Conseil national de transition, ou qui est partagé?
En termes de pourcentage, ce que je vous inviterai à faire, c'est regarder la carte. Si vous faites un triangle reliant Bani Walid et Sirte, et prenez Sheba comme point sud, ça vous donne en fait un triangle où en fait les forces kadhafistes ont été observées et où elles ont opéré. Ceci dit, comme j'ai mentionné dans mon exposé, il y a quand même quelques éléments clés de ce triangle-là qui ont été érodés au fil des derniers jours. Et donc, à l'heure actuelle, il n'est plus évident que les kadhafistes aient nécessairement accès à l'axe Bani Walid-Sirte à cause de la prise de position entre les deux villes. Donc, ce qui représente une rupture significative de leur capacité. Même chose à Sheba, où à l'heure actuelle, l'emprise des kadhafistes n'est plus assurée. C'est une ville qu'on considère contestée, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a aucune force, ni d'un côté ni de l'autre, qui semble totalement la contrôler. Donc, en gros, ça représente une portion relativement modeste du territoire et d'ailleurs une portion qui maintenant semble être contestée dans deux de ses axes principaux. Just for the benefit of the English-speaking people, I was asked about the area that was controlled by Gaddafi, and I basically said that if you do a triangle between Beni Walid and Sirte going towards Sheba, this is essentially the area where Gaddafi is operating or has been operating. What I wanted to stress, however, is that the latest advances of the NTC forces over the last 2 days have basically interrupted to some extent the communications between Bani Walid and Sirte. So it means that the area that is controlled by Gaddafi along the shore is being seriously contested. Similar situation in Sheba. At this time, we consider the city and its surrounding as being contested because there's no clear indication that the entire region is under the control of one or the other side. So essentially, the area of operation of Gaddafi is shrinking and is being contested even in its main communication lines, which from a military perspective, this means a lot because this prevents or inhibit Gaddafi's capability to pursue his aggressions.
Thank you for providing the answers in both languages, Roland. That's how effective OUP is. Kuna.
Nawab Khan from the Kuwait news agency Kuna. Colonel, you said earlier in your statement that the situation in Bani Walid and Sirte may change very rapidly. Are you suggesting that these two towns may fall into the hands of NTC forces in a day or two? Thank you.
What is difficult to predict here is that what will happen on the ground is not necessarily dependent on NATO, but of the actions of the two main parties there. So basically, they are the main trigger. What we do observe, however, is that the potential is there for very rapid change. Because there's a significant concentration of forces on both sides that are in those areas. And we're not talking about huge cities here. So if you look at what happened in other cities and villages, this could change indeed very rapidly, but I cannot predict when this will happen.
AFP over here.
Oui, une question en français. Je voulais savoir, avez-vous été surpris par la contre-offensive sur Ras Lanouf hier? Et est-ce que vous avez estimé le nombre de combattants pro-kadhafistes qui ont pris part à cette attaque? Et est-ce que l'OTAN participe aujourd'hui à des opérations pour reprendre les lieux? Et deuxièmement, est-ce que vous évaluez le nombre de combattants pro-Kadhafi actifs dans le triangle dont vous avez parlé tout à l'heure?
Donc, pour ce qui est de la situation à Ras Lanouf, la meilleure façon de décrire cette situation-là, c'est de parler de, excusez l'expression anglaise, d'un strike, autrement dit, d'une action ciblée dans le temps et dans l'espace. Autrement dit, ça ne reflète pas un gain ou une avancée territoriale des forces kadhafistes. Donc, on parle ici essentiellement d'une opération de style soit commando ou sabotage. À l'heure actuelle, on n'a pas en main toutes les données pour savoir s'agit-il d'un déplacement de troupes ou s'agit-il purement et simplement de forces ou de saboteurs qui étaient demeurés sur place à Ras Lanouf. Mais certainement, il n'y a pas de changement global dans les espaces contrôlés. Il s'agit d'une opération essentiellement isolée. Donc, ça répond un peu aussi à la deuxième question, à savoir qu'il n'y a pas nécessairement besoin d'opérations spécifiques pour répondre à cette situation-là. Ceci dit, nous avons comme politique de ne jamais commenter les opérations en cours. Juste pour satisfaire moindrement votre curiosité, je me contenterai de dire que nous surveillons de très près la situation, mais non seulement le long de la côte, dont à Ras Lanouf, mais dans le territoire complet. Just for the benefit of the English-speaking listeners, I was asked about the situation in Ras Lanouf. I described it as being a strike, meaning by that that this does not represent any significant shift in the positions controlled by the Gaddafi forces. This represents an actions made by a few individuals. At this stage, it's not clear if those individuals are simply saboteurs or if they are from another regions, but it does not represent a shift in the territorial base of the Gaddafi forces. And I concluded by saying that, of course, we are continuing our monitoring of the situation, not only on Ras Lanouf, but over the entire Libyan territory.
I'll take the last two questions we had from Brussels, one over there.
Sertaç Aktan from IHA News Agency, Turkey. Would you have any evaluation from NATO's side on the recent visits of Prime Minister Erdogan, Turkish Prime Minister, to the region, including Libya? How do you see Turkish influence on the region? Do you see as an asset to NATO? Thank you.
I understand Prime Minister Erdogan will be in Libya later this week, I think on Thursday. We can only welcome such visits. I know various allies have reopened or are in the process of reopening their diplomatic missions on the ground. And I see this as part of the wide and the broad trend of international recognition for the new Libya that's taken the future in its own hands. Last question here.
Oui. Mamedi du quotidien d'Oran en Algérie. On parle ces derniers temps de plusieurs membres de la famille de Kadhafi qui sont partis en Algérie, au Niger, on parle du Mali, bon, c'est pas très précis. Mais on parle également d'un mouvement de troupes pro-Kadhafi bien armées et beaucoup d'armes qui circulent, qui sont parties vers ces régions-là du Sahel. Et on parle même d'une jonction avec les éléments d'Al-Qaïda. Est-ce que cet aspect des choses, ma question est la suivante, est-ce que cet aspect des choses, cette prolifération des armes et cette jonction éventuelle entre les partisans de Kadhafi et des terroristes d'Al-Qaïda, est-ce que cet aspect des choses est pris en charge par les politiques de l'OTAN? Et est-ce qu'il y a une consultation ou des contacts avec les pays riverains du Sahel, c'est-à-dire l'Algérie, le Mali, le Niger, etc. Voilà.
Bon, ce sont des questions hypothétiques qui reposent surtout sur des informations médiatiques. Je n'ai aucune confirmation de ces informations. Ce que je peux vous dire en général, c'est qu'on est très encouragé par les déclarations de la part du Conseil national de transition, de son président, Mustafa Abdel Jalil, qui a clairement parler du fait que la nouvelle Libye ne va pas être extrémiste mais modérée. Il a parlé de réconciliation, d'unité, de droits de l'homme, de la démocratie. Et on a bien vu la feuille de route déjà présentée par le Conseil national de transition pour la transition démocratique de la Libye, qui démontre très clairement le désir sincère de démocratie de la NTC. Pour ce qui est la prolifération des armes, on continue à suivre ces aspects de très près. C'est bien sûr toujours un aspect qui peut causer des problèmes. C'est de la responsabilité du Conseil national de transition d'assurer que cette transition se fait de manière paisible et sans prolifération des armes. Pour le moment, c'est la responsabilité des Nations Unies d'aider le peuple libyen dans cette transition qui, bien sûr, ne sera pas aisée. L'OTAN reste à la disposition de l'ONU d'aider dans cette transition si on nous le demande. Mais comme vous savez, nous n'avons pas de troupes sur le terrain, pas de force sur le terrain. Alors, ce n'est pas à nous de contrôler ce qui se passe avec les dépôts d'armes. C'est surtout la responsabilité du Conseil national de transition des nouvelles autorités libyennes. Je ne sais pas si Roland a quelque chose à ajouter.
Pas vraiment.
Voilà. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. La semaine prochaine, je serai à New York, mais il y aura bien Carmen Romero et bien sûr Roland à Naples. À la prochaine.